Most people who keep an aloe vera plant on their windowsill have never seen it bloom. And that is not because they are doing something wrong. It is because the plant almost never does it. An aloe vera needs to reach at least 4 years of maturity before it can even attempt to produce a flower. Some sources put that number closer to 5. It requires extended hours of direct sunlight, not the filtered indoor light most of us give it, but real, full-spectrum exposure for most of the day. It needs warm temperatures during the growing season and a period of cooler dormancy during winter to trigger the internal signals that start bud development. It needs well-drained soil, a specific cycle of drought, followed by drenching, and in most cases, outdoor exposure to wind and pollinators. When all of those conditions finally align, something unusual happens. A single stalk pushes upward from the center of the rosette, sometimes reaching 2 to 3 feet in height. At the top of that stalk, dozens of small tubular flowers hang downward in a dense, cone-shaped cluster. Depending on the species, the blooms can range from yellow to orange to deep red. The whole display lasts about 2 to 3 weeks, and then it is over. The plant devotes almost all of its energy to this one reproductive effort before returning to its quiet, fleshy stillness. For most modern gardeners, the bloom is a pleasant surprise and a good photo opportunity, maybe something to post online. What nobody knew, or at least what most of us have forgotten, is that for thousands of years, civilizations across 3 continents treated that bloom as something else entirely, a message, a sign that the conditions surrounding that plant, the soil, the light, the energy of the space, were exactly right. The bloom was confirmation. And the plant behind that rare flower held a documented medical history stretching back more than 6,000 years across cultures that had no way of comparing notes. Egyptian embalmers used it. Greek battlefield surgeons depended on it. Indian healers built entire pharmaceutical categories around it. Crusader knights drank it in a cocktail they believed could extend their lives. Christopher Columbus carried it across the Atlantic. How does a single species end up at the center of medicine on every continent, independently, across millennia? That is the story most people have never heard. How does someone go from a humble, spiky succulent sitting in a clay pot to becoming the most documented medicinal plant in human history? The earliest answer comes from the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern Iraq. Around 2200 BCE, the Sumerians, one of the oldest civilizations known to historians, pressed cuneiform script into wet clay tablets in the city of Nippur. These tablets were not literature, they were medical instructions, recipes for treating specific conditions recorded by healers who took their work seriously enough to preserve it in permanent form. And among those instructions was aloe. The Sumerians did not think of illness the way we do today. To them, disease was a form of possession. Something had entered the body that did not belong there, something they described in spiritual terms as demonic. And aloe, with its thick, bitter gel, was considered a divine purifier. You consumed it, and whatever was inside you, whether they called it a demon or a toxin, was supposed to come out. That might sound primitive to modern ears, but here is what makes it remarkable. The Sumerians were describing a laxative and detoxifying agent 4,000 years before anyone had the vocabulary for those concepts. They observed the effect without understanding the mechanism, recorded it in a form that survived millennia, and they were right about what the plant could do. When modern pharmacologists eventually isolated the compounds responsible for aloe's purgative effect, the active ingredient turned out to be aloin, a bitter, yellow substance found just beneath the skin of the leaf. The Sumerians did not have the word for it, but they found the substance, figured out what it did, and wrote it down. The people of Mesopotamia also used aloe to protect their homes. They hung the plant near doorways to ward off evil spirits, a practice that would be echoed centuries later by Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca, who hung aloe over their doors, believing the sacred plant would shield their households from slander and ill fortune. Two cultures, separated by thousands of years and vastly different religious frameworks, arrived at the same domestic ritual around the same plant. Those clay tablets from Nippur remain the oldest known written reference to any plant being used as medicine. not just aloe, any plant at all. The entire recorded history of herbal medicine begins, as far as surviving documents can tell us, with aloe vera pressed into Sumerian clay. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't, because roughly 700 years later, a very different civilization, 1,000 miles to the west, arrived at the exact same conclusion about the exact same plant, entirely on its own. Ancient Egypt did not borrow its knowledge of aloe from Mesopotamia, at least not as far as historians can determine. The two traditions developed in parallel, drawing from a plant that grew wild across the arid regions connecting them. But Egypt took the relationship between humans and aloe vera to a level that nobody before or since has matched. Temple walls in Egypt depict aloe vera in stone engravings, dating as far back as 4000 BCE. Those carvings are some of the oldest known artistic representations of any medicinal plant anywhere in the world. And the Egyptians gave aloe a name that tells you exactly how they felt about it. They called it the plant of immortality. They meant it. The Ebers papyrus, discovered in Thebes in 1858 and dating to approximately 1550 BCE, is one of the most important medical documents to survive from the ancient world. It stretches roughly 20 meters in length, contains over 700 formulas and remedies across 110 pages, and addresses everything from anatomy to pharmacology to toxicology. Aloe appears repeatedly throughout the text. Burns, wounds, skin infections, ulcers, headaches, chest pains, allergic reactions. The Egyptians were not guessing. They had a working pharmacopoeia spanning centuries of accumulated knowledge, and aloe was one of its most frequently referenced ingredients. But the Egyptians did not stop at treating the living. They wove aloe into their most sacred rituals for the dead. When a pharaoh died, the funeral ceremony was by invitation only, and the price of admission was measured in aloe. A man's wealth and his esteem for the departed king were publicly judged by how many pounds of aloe he carried to the tomb as an offering. The plant's resin was mixed with myrrh and applied during the embalming process itself. Aloe's antibacterial and antifungal properties slowed the decomposition of tissue, preserving the skin's elasticity in the mummified body. For a culture that believed preserving the physical form was the doorway to eternal life, that property was not just medically useful, it was theologically essential. I mean, think about that for a second. A civilization that engineered the pyramids, that built monuments designed to stand for eternity, trusted one plant above almost all others to protect their rulers on the journey to the afterlife. That is not casual endorsement. That is deep, institutional faith in what this plant could do. And it was not only the priests and embalmers who valued aloe. Nefertiti, the queen whose name translates to "the beauty has come," used aloe gel as part of her daily skincare regimen around 1350 BCE. Cleopatra did the same more than 1,000 years later. Two of the most celebrated women in ancient history, separated by over a millennium, both reached for the same plant every morning. The Egyptians had connected aloe not just to healing and not just to the afterlife, but to beauty and youth, completing a symbolic triangle: preservation, restoration, and rejuvenation that no other plant in their entire catalogue could match. If you are wondering how that is even possible for a single species, so is everyone else. Someone who had been studying Egypt closely was paying attention. Around 330 BCE, Alexander the Great was in the middle of building the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. His armies stretched from Greece to the borders of India, and keeping those armies alive between battles was a logistical nightmare that most people do not think about when they picture ancient conquest. Soldiers got wounded constantly. Every engagement produced hundreds of men with gashes, punctures, broken skin, and infections waiting to set in. Without antibiotics, without sterile surgical tools, without hospitals, battlefield medicine came down to what you could carry with you and apply directly to the wound. And the best option available in the 4th century BCE was aloe vera. According to multiple historical accounts, it was Aristotle, Alexander's former teacher and one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, who advised him to do something strategically unusual: Aristotle told Alexander to capture the island of Socotra. Socotra sits roughly 150 miles off the coast of present-day Yemen, at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden. By 500 BCE, the island had already become famous across the ancient world for one thing: its aloe groves. The Socotrine aloe produced there was considered the finest available anywhere in the Mediterranean trade, and it was already being exported east to China, Tibet, and India along routes that predated the formal Silk Road by centuries. Alexander did not simply raid Socotra for a supply run, he conquered it. Historical records from the island's own chronology, documented by later chroniclers, indicate that around 330 BCE, Greek forces dispatched by Alexander overcame the existing Indian population on Socotra and established a permanent settlement. The new settlers were specifically tasked with cultivating and protecting the island's aloe supply. Alexander also ordered transportable carts of living aloe plants to travel with his army on campaign, providing a mobile source of fresh gel that could be applied to wounds without waiting for dried shipments from distant ports. That is not folk medicine. That is military logistics built around a single plant. The most powerful general in the ancient world restructured an island's civilian population and designed his supply chain around aloe vera, because he considered it that essential to keeping his soldiers alive. The knowledge Alexander's campaigns spread did not vanish after his empire fractured. It pooled in the cities he had founded, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean, and it filtered directly into the medical traditions of Greece and Rome. An outsider saw the pattern developing, but no one inside it could see the full picture yet. Around 70 CE, a Greek physician named Pedanius Dioscorides was traveling with the Roman armies under the reign of Emperor Nero, documenting every medicinal plant and substance he could find across the known world. The result was De Materia Medica, a 5-volume pharmacopoeia covering more than 600 plants. That text would remain the primary pharmaceutical reference across Europe and the Middle East for over 1,500 years. No medical book in human history has stayed in active use for longer. Dioscorides catalogued 19 separate uses for aloe vera. He recommended it for wounds, burns, hair loss, genital ulcers, hemorrhoids, mouth and gum irritation, and stomach complaints. He noted that the juice loosens the belly, cleansing the stomach, confirming the same purgative effect the Sumerians had recorded 2,000 years earlier. His contemporary, Pliny the Elder, validated these findings in his own encyclopedic work Natural History, and expanded the list to include treatments for leprosy, sores, and excessive perspiration. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians had developed a method for drying aloe pulp, making it lightweight and portable, and they exported it across the entire Greco-Roman world. For the first time in history, aloe vera was not a local remedy limited to the regions where the plant grew naturally. It was an internationally traded commodity, moving along the same shipping lanes as wine, olive oil, and grain. De Materia Medica was not just another herbal catalogue. It broke from everything that came before it. Dioscorides organized plants by their therapeutic effects rather than alphabetically, making it a practical clinical tool rather than a reference book. His approach was so effective that the text survived in continuous use for 15 centuries, copied by hand through the medieval period, translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, and finally printed during the Renaissance. The most famous surviving illustrated copy, the Vienna Dioscorides, was produced in Constantinople in 512 CE and given as a wedding gift to an emperor's daughter. That is the kind of cultural weight this book carried. What Dioscorides accomplished, perhaps without realizing its full significance, was something no one before him had done. He created a permanent written record thorough enough that the medical knowledge of multiple civilizations could finally be compared side by side. And the pattern that emerged was striking. Every culture that encountered aloe independently, Sumerians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, had arrived at the same core applications: wounds, burns, digestive problems, skin conditions. No one was copying anyone else's notes. The plant itself was consistent, and by the 1st century CE, The documented record of those consistent results stretched back over 2,000 years. While the Greeks and Romans were cataloguing aloe from the outside, listing what it could treat and how to apply it, practitioners thousands of miles to the east were approaching the same plant from a completely different philosophical framework. In India's Ayurvedic medical tradition, aloe vera carries the Sanskrit name Kumari. The word translates to young girl or maiden, and that name is not poetic decoration. It reflects the plant's deep association in Ayurvedic thought with feminine health, rejuvenation, and the restoration of youthful vitality. Where the Egyptians saw immortality and the Greeks saw a wound healer, Indian practitioners saw something more systemic, a plant that could bring the entire body back into balance. Ayurveda classifies aloe vera as tridoshic, meaning it balances all three of the body's fundamental energies, known as doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha. That classification is genuinely rare. Most plants in the Ayurvedic system affect one or two doshas. For a single plant to harmonize all three placed aloe in an elite pharmaceutical category, alongside only a handful of other substances in the entire tradition. Later, Ayurvedic scholars, including Acharya Kayadeva, went further, designating aloe as both a rasayana, a rejuvenator, and a vrasya, an aphrodisiac, categories reserved for the most valued ingredients in the system. And there is a detail here that connects directly back to the bloom. The Kayadeva Nihantu, a medieval Indian pharmaceutical text, specifically discusses the flowers of aloe vera, not the gel, not the leaves, the flowers. The text identifies the blooms as vermicidal, effective against parasitic worms. This is one of the very few ancient sources anywhere in the world that assigns a specific medical function to the aloe flower itself, rather than to the plant. So when an aloe bloomed in an Indian healer's garden, it was not merely a sign that the plant was healthy. The flowers themselves were a usable medicine. The bloom was the harvest. That is a fundamentally different way of relating to a flowering event than anything the Western traditions described. And it developed entirely independently, thousands of miles from Egypt or Greece, with no shared texts, no overlapping intellectual tradition, and no communication between the practitioners involved. The same plant kept producing the same results for people who had no reason to expect it. That was the pattern nobody could explain yet. The story of aloe does not pause neatly between the ancient world and the medieval one. It keeps moving, and it picks up some unexpected characters along the way. During the Crusades, which began in 1096 CE and stretched across roughly 200 years of intermittent warfare, European Christian knights encountered aloe in the Holy Land for the first time. Most of them treated it as a curiosity. One group took it very seriously. The Knights Templar, the warrior monks who grew into one of the most powerful and wealthy military orders in medieval history, developed a concoction they called the elixir of Jerusalem. The recipe, as multiple historical accounts describe it, combined palm wine, aloe vera pulp, and hemp. The Templars believed this drink could accelerate the healing of battlefield wounds, purify the body, and extend their lifespan. Whether the elixir of Jerusalem actually delivered on those longevity claims is debatable, but the Templars were undeniably healthier than the general population around them, and their practices offer some explanation. They followed mandatory hand-washing before meals and prayers. They maintained strict dietary regulations. They enforced hygiene standards that were literally centuries ahead of the broader European population. Brothers assigned to outdoor manual labor were exempted from food preparation, a precaution against cross-contamination that would not become standard practice in Western medicine for another 600 years. If the aloe in their elixir was delivering even a fraction of the anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, and digestive benefits that Dioscorides had documented 1,000 years earlier, it was providing meaningful medical support in an era where those properties were the difference between surviving a wound and dying of a secondary infection. The Templars may not have understood the chemistry behind their elixir, but they understood results, and they kept drinking it. The aloe trade itself continued to expand after the Crusades faded. By the 17th century, The East India Trading Company was purchasing Socotrine aloe from the same island Alexander the Great had conquered 2,000 years earlier. The supply chain he had built, Greek settlers cultivating aloe on Socotra, was still functioning, still producing, still exporting the same product across the same waters. And then, the plant crossed the Atlantic. Before the plant reached the New World, it had already made an appearance in Scripture. King Solomon, the biblical king famous for his wisdom, is said to have cultivated his own aloe. The Song of Solomon references aloe alongside myrrh and the finest spices, and Psalm 45 describes garments fragrant with myrrh, aloes, and cassia. Whether these references describe the same species we call aloe vera today or a related aromatic plant is debated by scholars. But the association between aloe and sacred value runs consistently through Hebrew, Egyptian, and early Christian texts. Christopher Columbus kept potted aloe vera plants growing aboard his ships during his voyages to the New World. He is credited with one of the most quoted statements in herbal history, listing aloe alongside wheat, grapes, and olives as the four plants indispensable to human well-being. The first nourishes, the second raises the spirit, the third brings harmony, and the fourth cures. Spanish monks, particularly Jesuit missionaries, carried aloe with them as they established missions across the Caribbean, Central America, and eventually into California, Florida, and Texas. They did not just transport the plant, they actively cultivated it, spreading it to regions where it had never grown before and teaching local populations its medicinal uses. A ship's physician traveling with Columbus, Diego Alvarez Chanca, recorded that species of aloe useful to doctors were already growing in Hispaniola, suggesting the plant may have spread even faster than the missionaries themselves. Within a century, aloe vera had gone from an old world medical staple to a new world transplant, and the indigenous populations of the Americas developed their own applications for it independently. Some native tribes elevated aloe to the status of one of their 16 sacred plants, incorporating it into rituals and remedies alike. They discovered that diluted aloe juice worked as an effective insect repellent when applied to skin, and as a preservative when applied to wood and other materials, applications that directly echo the Egyptian embalming practices from 3,500 years earlier. Different continent, different millennium, same plant, same instinct. If you are finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. I cover stories like this regularly. So the question that had been building for 6,000 years, the one nobody in any single civilization could answer, because nobody had visibility across all of them, finally landed in a place where it could be addressed. The 20th century brought aloe vera into the laboratory, and what scientists found inside those thick, fleshy leaves was more complex than anyone had anticipated. Aloe vera contains more than 200 bioactive compounds. That includes vitamins A, bone, B2, B3, B6, B9, B12, C, and E. It contains minerals including calcium, iron, zinc, magnesium, copper, potassium, and manganese. It carries enzymes, amino acids, polysaccharides, and saponins. And its anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties, the same ones the Egyptians relied on for embalming and Dioscorides prescribed for wounds, have been confirmed and measured in controlled clinical studies. The genus Aloe itself contains more than 500 recognized species spread across Africa, Madagascar, and the Arabian Peninsula. A study published in BMC Evolutionary Biology traced the evolutionary origin of the entire genus to southern Africa. Approximately 16 million years ago, the genus underwent two major diversification events, and the second one, roughly 10 million years ago, produced the thick, gel-filled succulent leaves that define the medicinal species. The researchers found a strong correlation. Species with larger, more succulent leaves were significantly more likely to have been selected by human cultures for medicinal use. In other words, the same evolutionary feature that made certain aloes medically useful was exactly what ancient healers across every continent selected for, consistently, without any knowledge of evolution or genetics. They could not have articulated why those particular plants worked better, but they picked them anyway, every time. One of the most striking modern findings involves aloe's use after the atomic bomb. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Japanese physicians reportedly turned to aloe vera to treat radiation burns on survivors' skin. The same plant that Egyptian healers had used for burn treatment 3,500 years earlier was being applied to wounds caused by a weapon that did not exist until the 20th century. The technology changed. The burns changed. The plant they reached for did not. The aloe market today is worth an estimated $13 billion globally. Products derived from aloe vera gel appear in everything from skincare creams and shampoos to digestive supplements and wound treatments. The plant that the Sumerians pressed into clay and the Egyptians wrapped around their dead is now a line item in the global pharmaceutical and cosmetics economy. But here is the part that should stop you for a moment. The Sumerians in Nippur, the Egyptian priests wrapping pharaohs in aloe-soaked linen, Aristotle whispering military strategy to Alexander, Dioscorides riding with the Roman legions, writing down 19 uses by lamplight, Indian healers waiting for the rare bloom so they could harvest the flowers for treatments against parasites, Templar knights mixing their elixir between sieges, Columbus tending potted aloe on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. None of them had access to gas chromatography or mass spectrometry. None of them could identify asmanan or aloin by chemical name. None of them knew about polysaccharides or bioactive compounds, but they all reached for the same plant, used it for the same core purposes, and passed that knowledge forward to the next generation, who passed it forward again for 6,000 years without interruption. The aloe vera plant sitting on your windowsill right now carries that entire history in its leaves. And if one day, after 4 or 5 years of patient, quiet growth, it sends up a single tall stalk, crowned with small, drooping, tubular flowers in shades of yellow and orange, you will be witnessing something that Egyptian priests, Greek generals, Indian physicians, and Crusader knights all treated as a moment worth noticing. The bloom was never just about the flower. It was about what the flower confirmed, that the conditions were right, that the plant had reached its full expression. That something very old and very tested was offering what it had always offered, if you paid attention. 6,000 years of healers, across civilizations that rose and fell and never met each other, all reached the same conclusion about this one quiet, spiky plant. They did not all get it wrong. And the next time you walk past one of those unassuming succulents at the garden center, maybe you will think about that.